the 6th of June, 1944, a little after 1 o'clock in the morning, above the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy, anti-aircraft fire climbs through the cloud in slow orange strings. The transport formations break apart. Men step out of the doors into black air and come down in fields they have never seen, in a country stitched together with earth banks and thorn. Somewhere in that scattering is Captain Bob Piper of G Company, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division. A photograph survives of him in Normandy, standing in front of the broken frame of a Horsa glider. In his hands is a weapon that looks like something a mechanic left behind on a workbench, a steel tube, a wire stock. No wood, no polish, nothing you would call craftsmanship. That weapon cost the United States government $20.94. It was built by a company that made headlights for motor cars. Soldiers took one look at it and named it the grease gun, and they did not mean it as a compliment. Here is what almost every telling of this story gets wrong. The crudeness was not a failure. The crudeness was the design. Every ugly weld and every stamped panel on that gun was a deliberate answer to a problem that nearly strangled the American war effort in 1942. And the legend that has grown around it since, the one about German soldiers dreading the sound of it in the hedgerows, does not survive contact with the records. This is not a story about a wonder weapon. It is a story about a nation choosing adequate in enormous numbers over excellent far too late. And it is a story about what actually happened when that choice reached the bocage. To understand why America needed an ugly gun, you have to understand the beautiful one it already had. The Thompson submachine gun was a superb piece of engineering. It was accurate. It was reliable. Soldiers loved it and went on loving it long after they were told to hand it in. It was also an industrial disaster. The original Thompson was a machined weapon, cut and fitted from solid steel by skilled hands, and it cost the government somewhere between $200 and $225 per gun. Set that figure against the war America was about to fight. Millions of men, multiple continents, every division wanting close quarters, firepower at once. At that price, and at that pace of manufacture, the arithmetic simply did not close. Ordnance did what it could. The Thompson was simplified into the M1, which deleted the blish lock and the cuts compensator and moved the cocking handle to the side of the receiver. Then it was simplified again into the M1A1, with a fixed firing pin machined into the bolt face. Each round of surgery cut the price. The M1A1 came down to roughly $45, and there the process stopped because there was nothing left to cut. The Thompson had been simplified as far as a machined weapon can be simplified. If America wanted cheaper, America needed a different idea entirely. That idea already existed. It belonged to the enemy and to the ally. The Germans had the MP-40, a submachine gun built substantially from stamped sheet metal and welded assemblies at something in the region of 57 Reichsmark. The British, with their backs to the wall after Dunkirk, had gone further still and produced the Steen, a weapon of pipe and pressings that cost under £3 sterling and looked every bit as inelegant as that suggests. In 1941, the American Ordnance Board studied both of them. The conclusion was uncomfortable and correct. Sheet metal stamping, the technology of car bodies and kitchen appliances, could turn out serviceable automatic weapons at a fraction of the cost and a multiple of the speed of traditional gun-making. The requirement that followed was blunt. Build it almost entirely from stampings. Chamber it for the standard American 45 ACP cartridge. Machine as little as humanly possible. Make it cheaper than the Thompson, and make it hit a 6-foot square target at 50 yards with 9/10 of a burst, fired standing. The men who answered that requirement deserve their names spoken properly. The action came from George Hyde, a designer already known inside the trade for the Hyde submachine gun and for the strange little single-shot Liberator pistol. Hyde had spent years as a machinist and foreman at Griffin and Howe, among the finest rifle makers in America. There is a quiet irony worth holding on to here. The American answer to the German submachine gun was drawn up by a man born in Germany, in the village of Opfing engine in 1888, turning that action into something a stamping plant could vomit out by the thousand fell to Frederick Sampson, chief engineer of the Inland Manufacturing Division of General Motors. Driving the whole program through the Army bureaucracy was Colonel Rene Studler of Ordnance Research and Development. The prototype was designated T-15. It fired 45 ACP, had a sliding wire stock, and offered both single shots and automatic fire. Then, on the 8th of October 1942, the specification changed. The gun was to accept a 9mm conversion, and semi-automatic fire was to be deleted altogether. The result was redesignated T-20. Deleting single-shot fire sounds like a downgrade. It was not. The cyclic rate had been set so low that a trained man could squeeze off one round at a time with nothing but trigger discipline. Removing the selector removed parts, and parts were the enemy. Then came Aberdeen Proving Ground, and the results that silenced the skeptics. On accuracy, the T-20 put 97 hits out of 100 onto the 6-foot target at 50 yards. A Thompson fired as the control managed 93. In endurance testing, the prototype fired 5,000 rounds of 45 ACP with only 2 failures to feed, and both were traced to defective magazine followers rather than the gun. Across the whole trial program, it scored roughly 95 out of 100, reported at the time as the highest figure any weapon in that class had achieved. Buried in mud and choked with dust, it kept running when better-bred rivals stopped. The recommendation went up in December 1942. The Ordnance Committee memorandum was dated the 23rd of that month, and formal approval followed on the 11th of January 1943. The weapon entered service as United States submachine gun, caliber 45 M3. Now look at what they had actually built. A tube. The receiver was 2 halves of sheet steel, each about 1/16 of an inch thick, pressed to shape and welded together along the seam. Inside it, a heavy bolt ran on twin steel guide rods with telescoping springs, engineered so that the bolt never hammered against the end of the receiver. Blowback operated, fired from an open bolt, fully automatic only. The barrel was 8 inches long, cold swagged rather than cut rifled. Overall length ran to about 30 inches with the wire stock extended, and around 23 inches with it pushed home. Loaded weight was roughly 8 pounds, some 4 pounds lighter than the Thompson it replaced. Muzzle velocity, about 920 feet per second. Effective range, 100 yards and no arguments. The cyclic rate was the quiet masterstroke, somewhere between 350 and 450 rounds a minute, commonly cited at about 400. Slow enough that the muzzle did not climb away from a standing man. Slow enough to count your shots. In a weapon this light, that restraint was worth more than any refinement. There was no conventional safety catch. The dust cover over the ejection port was the safety, and that was the whole philosophy of the gun in one detail. If a part could be deleted, it was deleted. If a part could do 2 jobs, it did 2 jobs. Manufacture went to the guide lamp division of General Motors at Anderson, Indiana, chosen for one reason. Guide lamp knew sheet metal. The only significant machine components in the entire weapon were the bolt, subcontracted to the Buffalo Arms Company, and the swagged barrel. The economics that came out the other end are the real story of this weapon. $18.36 for the gun, less its bolt. $2.58 for the bolt. $20.94 in total. Less than half the price of the simplified Thompson. Less than a good automatic pistol. Speed mattered as much as price. At full stride, a finished gun left the Anderson line roughly every 2 minutes and 24 seconds. By June 1944, the plant was turning out 1,000 of them every 24 hours. Before the war ended, more than 600,000 had been made. One quick word before the fighting starts. If this is your sort of history, a subscribe helps. Onward. Normandy is where the grease gun first went to war, and Normandy is where the myths begin. The country behind the invasion beaches is called the bocage, and it was the worst possible ground for an army built on movement and firepower. Small fields, averaging something like 400 yards by 200, each one walled by an earth bank grown thick with roots and thorn. Estimates of those banks vary considerably. The American Combat Studies Institute puts them at 1 to 4 feet thick and anywhere from 3 to 15 feet high. The wartime pamphlet Combat Lessons described walls 8 to 10 feet wide and 4 to 6 feet high. French sources measuring the surviving hedges cite average heights greater still. The numbers disagree. The effect does not. Between the banks ran sunken lanes, roofed over by branches, dark at midday. Visibility in places came down to a few yards. Every field was a walled room, and the enemy held the walls. Michael Dubler's study of the campaign for the Combat Studies Institute puts it plainly. The bocage effectively took away the American advantages of tactical mobility and firepower. Artillery could not see, armor could not maneuver. Fights happened at a distance where a man could hear the other man breathing. The cost was appalling. Leo Doherty records the First Army taking 40,000 casualties for an advance of 7 miles across 17 days. Give that a face. The 11th of July, 1944, at 0600 hours, after an hour of shelling, the 116th Infantry of the 29th Division went at Martinville Ridge outside St. Helene. Captain Charles Cawthon, who was there, described the smoke and the stench of it. Rifle companies that had gone in 150 to 180 strong came out at around 60. This is the fighting into which the grease gun made its debut. Some paratroopers of the 82nd and the 101st Airborne jumped with them on the 6th of June. Captain Piper is photographed with one. So is a headquarters trooper of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment. Those images are the hard evidence, and they are worth more than a shelf of assertions. But honesty demands the rest of it, because this channel lives on being right. The grease gun wasn't the American submachine gun of Normandy. The Thompson was. Wartime Thompson production ran past 1.5 million weapons, outnumbering the M3 family by roughly 3 to 1, and the men who carried Thompsons had no intention of giving them up. Guidelamp had planned to deliver 20,000 M3s by July 1943, and had actually delivered 900. The line only hit full speed as the invasion fleet sailed. The grease gun became genuinely common in tank and tank destroyer crews later, through the autumn and winter and on to the end of the war in Europe. And the claim that gives this weapon its internet reputation, that German soldiers feared it, has no support that I can find in any primary or scholarly source. Not in interrogation reports. Not in Wehrmacht assessments. It appears in video titles and nowhere that matters. The truth is close to the reverse. In the bocage, the small arms advantage belonged to the Germans, and it had a name, the MG42, firing at 12 to 1,500 rounds a minute, a sound American infantry learned to dread and never forgot. Behind it, the MG34, the MP40 in the hands of section commanders, and a scattering of the new STG-44 assault rifles. What terrified men in the hedgerows was volume of automatic fire at close range. The grease gun was not the thing doing the terrifying. It was America's cheapest possible answer to never having enough of it, nor was the weapon flawless. Through early 1944, training establishments reported the side-mounted cocking crank, snapping clean off, traced to poor-grade steel and faulty heat treatment. Drop the gun on its right side and it could be finished. In May 1944, the Tank Destroyer Board flagged a magazine catch that could be knocked by accident, dumping the magazine, and a guard was added. The magazine itself, a scaled-up copy of the Sten pattern with 2 columns of ammunition funneling into a single feed point, was the weakest thing about the whole design, and stayed that way. Ordnance fixed what it could. The M3A1, standardized on the 21st of December 1944, deleted the fragile crank entirely and replaced it with a finger hole cut into the bolt. You cocked it by putting your finger in the gun. It strengthened the rear sight, built the magazine loading tool into the wire stock, and moved the oiler into the pistol grip. It arrived too late to matter much to the war, but it is the reason the design lasted another 50 years. So how does it actually stand against its rivals? Let us be fair, because the grease gun does not need help. Against the Thompson, the M3 was cheaper, 4 pounds lighter, shorter, easier to control, and better in filth. The Thompson was more accurate, far better made, easier to reload, and fed by a magazine that genuinely worked. Soldiers who had one guarded it. That is not sentiment. It is a verdict, and it deserves respect. Against the Steen, the M3 was the better gun and the more expensive one. The Steen was cruder still and cheaper still, and it armed a nation that had left its rifles on a French French beach. Britain got there first, and the Americans had the sense to learn from it. Against the MP-40, the honors are close. The German weapon was heavier, better finished, and fitted with a folding stock rather than a wire loop, and its low rate of fire made it just as controllable. It was a very good submachine gun. The M3 was simply cheaper and quicker to build, and in a war of production that is its own kind of superiority. Against the PPSH-41, the comparison is almost comic. The Soviet weapon fired the 7.62 by 25 cartridge at around 900 rounds a minute from a 71-round drum. Nothing in the American inventory could match that wall of fire at 10 yards. It was heavy, hard to hold on target, and made in something like 6 million examples. Where the Russians chose volume, the Americans chose control. Both answers were correct for the armies that made them, and the grease gun outlived nearly all of them. It went to Korea, it went to Vietnam. Silenced versions went into Iran on the failed hostage rescue in 1980. Argentina built its own and called it the Greaser. American armored crews still had M3A1s stowed in their vehicles during the Gulf War, half a century after George Hyde sketched the action. No submachine gun has served the United States longer. Return now to that photograph. Captain Bob Piper, Normandy, 1944, standing in front of a wrecked glider with a length of welded pipe in his hands. Everything about that weapon was a compromise. The sights were rudimentary. The magazine was its own worst enemy. The cocking handle would snap if you were unlucky. It was, exactly as its critics said, crude. But it worked. It arrived, and there were enough of them. In 1942, the United States faced a question that no amount of gunsmithing could answer. How do you put automatic fire into the hands of millions of men on two oceans at once? The elegant answer cost $200 and could not be built fast enough. The ugly answer cost $20.94 and came off the line every 2.5 minutes, and it kept coming until the ugliness stopped being a joke and started being the point. We tell ourselves that wars are won by the finest weapon ever made. They are not. They are won by the merely adequate weapon that arrives in numbers, in time, in the hands of the man standing in the ditch.